Ah, the Paladin, the goody two-shoes of any D&D campaign if there ever was one. The perfect class for that weird guy at your group who swears he's not religious but can only come up with a character who is basically just a Knight Templar in a fantasy setting. Priding themselves on their goodwill and the exacting of justice, Paladins are often stalwart defenders of all things innocent in fantasy lands, and as a class with plenty of health, damage and even a pool of free healing, they're often seen as a perfect beginner class. I'd say that's a bit of a pitfall myself, as if you go on any RPG horror story subreddit or take a look at the YouTube channels that cover them, you'll find people misunderstanding the Paladin are nearly as common as those who ruin the game with their power fantasy rogue. The Paladin can be great, but if used incorrectly, it can come across as a drag to the party. The rogue and bard can't get up to their usual antics while he's around because he'll eventually report them to the guards. Oh, they can't even think about playing along with an evil guy because that would mean going against an oath. It spirals into one player feeling like a sore thumb, which should ideally never happen. If you want to avoid these scenarios or you just want some tips on how to keep a paladin fresh and entertaining, I've got my top 5 tips on becoming a better paladin in Dungeons & Dragons. Tip number 1. Strength or charisma? Paladins are fairly unique in the realm of D&D as they arguably have 2 primary stats they'll want to maximise. Similarly to how the monk needs to decide between being super dexterous or super wise, a paladin can really rely on either strength or charisma as their main stat, and in my opinion, you should choose one to really focus on while leaving the other as possibly even your tertiary stat behind constitution. No matter what type of paladin you're playing, you're going to need health as you'll likely be in the forefront of combat. So how do you go about deciding what paladin to be? Well, it's largely based on your party composition or the type of character you'd like to play. Do you want to be the face that runs the place, the bold, daring paladin who gives a charming smile and a cheeky wink to those he passes by as he struts through the streets? In that case, you might want to take a stronger charisma stat as you'll need it for chatting with NPCs and ensuring that you can pull off any persuasion or intimidation you may need. Charisma is also strong for your spellcasting and aura paladins. If you're not that bothered about always getting your hits in and instead don't mind just sitting there in the centre of combat, using your action to buff and heal your party while giving them a +5 to every saving throw they make, you can really be one of the most useful supports in the game. However, if you want that Templar roleplay and need to dole out justice with a big, smiting hammer, then strength is your best friend. You won't be as much of a defensive support, but then again, who needs defense against enemies if they can be killed in a single smite? For this, your spell slots will be going into smiting, and your charisma will really be just used on the odd occasion you're called upon to speak with someone, and the little bit of buff that it'll give with the aura of protection. If you don't already have a strength main in the party, or even if you do, you'll be needed as a strength paladin to add some extra muscle with your big hits. Tip number 2. Don't become your oath. As a paladin, at some point you'll stick yourself with an oath. The vast majority of these oaths will follow a similar theme of making sure you're a good guy who does generally good things. Not all of them require you to do the same things. The Oath of Vengeance, for example, really lets you get away with a lot so long as you're hunting down your target, but unlike most other classes or characters you'll play, the paladin does have a code you must follow, or else you could lose out on your powers and become an oath breaker depending on how your DM likes to run things. That has its own strengths that we'll get into in another tip, but a paladin's oath is often seen, especially to newer players, as a bit of a box that keeps them from doing certain things. We've all heard the horror stories of the PvP being started in-game between a rogue who wanted to steal something and a paladin who wouldn't let them. Now, if tensions are high in your party, so long as the game isn't ruined by it and everyone's cool, I think you can run with some bickering between party members, but that shouldn't come from a place of, "my character wouldn't allow this." Your character should be willing to work with the other party mates. A session 0 can help with this, but you can also make life easier for your table by not being your rules. Think as your oath more of a set of principles you uphold, but they do not force you to stop anyone you witness doing anything that you wouldn't do. If your party is not an evil one and they're working towards a greater good, you can tell yourself that and allow them to take that artifact or pretend they're working for the villain for the time being. This isn't to say your character can't have their moments, but it is a recommendation that you should really be trying to avoid unnecessary confrontations about your oath, especially when you can just think of some creative ideas to skirt around your character not caring or pushing aside their feelings for now, knowing that your party will fight for the greater good overall. If they don't, then you can raise that in character, which could lead to some fun roleplay. Tip number 3. Spells are quite good, actually. It might be easy to forget this, but Paladins are spellcasters. Like the Ranger, they've not got spells all the way up to level 9, but they do get some useful things to cast in their kit. Now, the temptation, especially for those damage fiends among you, will be to just use your spell levels as a smite pool, but if you want your Paladins to feel unique, it's worth looking at the spells you get and seeing what fun things you can do with them. Depending on what you pick as well, not only do you get some good options, but your character will feel much more flavourful. Take something like Compelled Duel, for example. Not only is it a great way to keep aggro off the squishier members of your party, but it can also create an impactful RP moment. As your party's defender, the pure of heart hero that will never stop fighting until justice has prevailed, it's pretty cool to force an enemy to take you on. Or, if you want to spend your concentration on something else, Shield of Faith can make you a near untouchable tank right from the early levels, especially if you're rocking a shield and protection fighting style. Combine this with Fine Steed, and you and your Great Stallion can share the bonus to AC. There's also the other smites available to a Paladin as well. Thunderous Smite might do less damage on average than a regular smite, but if you knock someone down to gain advantage on your next attacks, it's going to be worth it. The same is true for Wrathful Smite, Blinding Smite, hell, pretty much all of the smite spells are worth testing out, at least in my opinion, as they'll give you an extra bit of damage as well as an interesting effect. While the best enemy is a dead enemy, and just spamming Divine Smites can make them dead faster, I've seen a lot of Paladins just run at the boss, spam smites until they get a good chunk of damage in, and then fall over because the boss can hit back harder than they can. This is especially true if they don't have anything like prone, fear, or another condition preventing the boss from hitting back. It might sound like I'm not really talking about the Paladin's support options here, and that's true, but it's for two reasons. The first is that, if we're being honest, the Paladin simply can't be a pure supporter class like the Cleric. It just doesn't have the spellcasting capability, and it would be a waste to spend all of your holy muscle patting people on the back with lay on hands. Secondly, I think the Paladin is a class whereby focusing on making yourself stronger, you will be making the party better off. That doesn't mean hoard all the magic items, but it does mean that a Paladin casting something like Cure Wounds or Prayer of Healing just isn't as useful as one spending those spell slots to make something else dead, or themselves more likely to make that thing dead. This is even true if you go for the full Charisma Paladin that I talked about in the first point, as really their biggest support power is granting others that +5 to all saves when Aura of Protection rolls around. Consider that tip 3.5 if you will, but the main thing to remember here is don't just discount the Paladin as a smiting machine, as they also get some great utility in their spells, even if some of those are just more smites. Tip number 4. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. This might not be true in your experience, but in mine I find a lot of people go for either absolute good or utter evil with their Paladins. There are those players that love to really play the lawful good hero and will go out of their way to try and fight any and all evils, or make sure that no NPC is left without a smile on their face by the end of an arc. And then, in response to that, you get the people that want to be the fallen heroes, who smite only to destroy the innocents, and have broken their oaths before you can even describe the tavern they start a campaign in. Because of the Oathbreaker and because of how it is often described and perceived, I think a lot of Paladin players might have this idea that they're not so much a three-dimensional character as other classes might be, and so they have to stick to a good or evil sense of play. To me, that's utter rubbish. There's no need to throw your lot in with the most righteous Boy Scouts in Faerun, nor do you have to go full Joe Manganiello and declare yourself for a dark god in order to show how metal you are. Both of these are fine options, by the way. My tip is more saying that you can think outside of the box a bit more with a Paladin and still stick with the oath you want to have. As I said in tip 2, Paladins aren't as rigid as you first expect when you're reading about them. I've always interpreted their oaths more as a code they try to live their best by, rather than something that they must follow or else they risk losing everything they've worked for. This means that while even Wizards of the Coast recommends that you go for a character that follows a good alignment, it doesn't mean you can't mix things up a bit to give yourself the character you want without compromise. I believe your oath should define your Paladin in some ways. It's either the result of, or could even be, the inciting incident for your character, the thing that makes them who they are, but that doesn't mean all Paladins are lumped into one group or another. The Vengeance Paladin is one of the most popular, at least in my experience, because its simple goal of taking out one or a bunch of enemies your character really hates means you can be quite loose with your moral compass at times. Even looking at other oaths, you can see plenty of room to maneuver and make something unique. The Oath of the Crown could see your Paladin grow increasingly distrustful of a ruler they once believed in, which could even see you break your oath for good reason, despite the subclass's evil-leaning tendencies. The Oath of Glory from the Mythic Odysseys of Theros designs you to be a hero of Greek legend, but if you've ever read the Iliad, the Aeneid, or the Odyssey, you'll know that these heroes are complex people, to say the least. You can be someone who feels the pull of the dark, but tries their best to stick with the tenets of their oath in their own interpretation of them. Essentially, this kind of builds on from tip 2, as rather than just think about whether you're a good or evil paladin and pick an oath that resembles that, I'd say really read through the description of each oath that interests you and find ways to fit it around your character without just being lawful stupid one way or the other. Tip number 5, ration your resources. A lot of people point to the Paladin as a great class for beginners of the game, and while I think they can be a good way to learn a little bit of everything, they are surprisingly complex because of the sheer amount of stuff you have got in front of you. You've got to think about armour, weapons, whether you've got to wield a shield or not, whether you're going to max charisma or strength, your healing pool, spells, and smites. A lot of these features are limited resources too, with barely anything the Paladin has coming back on a short rest. And so, if you're in any sort of regular game where you're likely going to be getting more than one encounter in a given adventuring day, it's best to learn how to ration your resources. Lay on hands your healing pool is pretty easy in theory to ration, only heal people when they're hurt, right? Well, I think there's another layer to that, and I would say that healing is usually best done through lay on hands when someone is either down or seriously low. Then you get to make the most of the limited healing you have by bringing someone up from unconsciousness without feeling like you're blowing through your healing just so the wizard can take one more hit. Either way, if they're going to be down in another round, best to have them on a smaller amount of HP so you've got the points spare to bring them back again. Smites are arguably going to be the hardest thing for you to ration. After all, it feels so good to be able to absolutely decimate a creature by blowing your highest spell slots right off the bat on turn 1. However, if you know you're going to fight a Lich today, and right now you're only taking on some of his ghoulish goons, well then you might want to save the extra damage for when it really counts. The Paladin seems like the strongest class in the game when it has the resources to burst down any foe in front of it, but you also want to make sure you've got the lasting potential to do those big smites throughout an adventuring day. As spells and smites use the same resource pool as well, you're going to have to really think about what spells you want to cast in a given day. Usually I'd say it's worth starting off a combat or day with the buffs you want, then you can smite a bit more freely without guilt, as you won't feel like you've missed out on casting something you needed. As well, it's worth noting you shouldn't try and double up on one resource. Lay on hands is a perfectly good healing pool, and so you shouldn't be grabbing things like cure wounds in your spells as well. There's simply no point. But otherwise, that's the Paladin. I did find it hard to come up with tips here that cover the whole class without just saying generic things like use smite or wear armour. As the Paladin is such a strong class, you could easily skip out on some of these tips, or forget them from time to time and still feel like you could solo an adventure when you get to the higher levels. If the protagonist was a character, it would be a Paladin in most campaigns, but some of the time they're far too humble to let that go to their head. Stick to your oath, smite some bad guys, protect your friends with your aura, and you'll purge the evils of the world in no time. Thank you very much for watching. If you got this far, a like, subscribe, and comment are always very much enjoyed on this channel. But until then, I'll be seeing you soon, ghouls and gals. Bye bye.